My name is Clara Monroe, and for most of my 34 years, I lived my life as if I were a footnote in someone else's story. I was born and raised in the quiet, rolling hills of Crestwood, a town where the seasons change with gentle certainty and secrets are kept behind neatly painted front doors. My childhood was a watercolor painting left out in the rain, the colors muted and bleeding at the edges, mostly due to my mother, Eleanor. She was a woman of sharp angles and sharper words, who loved me in the way one loves a disappointing investment, with a constant, low-grade sense of what could have been. I found my escape, my solace, in the hushed aisles of the Gilded Page, our local bookstore, a sanctuary smelling of old paper, binding glue, and brewed tea. It was there, between the covers of books, that I learned about worlds bigger and brighter than my own. It was also there, 10 years ago, that I met Julian. He was a contractor, confident and handsome, with a laugh that seemed to fill every empty space inside me. He saw me, a shy librarian with ink-stained fingers and a tendency to apologize for taking up space, and he chose me. I never quite understood why, but I spent a decade being deeply, overwhelmingly grateful. We built a life in a charming cedar-shingled house on Willow Creek Lane, the kind with a porch swing and a climbing rose bush. We had a son, Milo, a bright, perceptive boy who inherited my love for stories and his father's steady gaze. He was the sun around which my small universe revolved. I thought our life was a quiet kind of perfect. I thought I was loved. I had mistaken the cage for a sanctuary, and I was about to find the key. The autumn leaves crunched under my feet as I stood frozen behind the sprawling oak in my mother's backyard. My 9-year-old son, Milo, was gripping my hand, his small fingers a knot of tension against my palm. Nothing, however, could compare to the icy stillness that had taken hold of my heart. Through the thin glass of the kitchen window, the two people I trusted most in the world were dismantling my life, piece by painful piece. She's like a porcelain doll, Eleanor. Beautiful to look at, but you're terrified she'll break if you breathe on her wrong. My husband Julian's voice, thick with a weariness I'd never heard before, drifted through the crisp air. I can't keep walking on eggshells. The constant neediness, the crying. I'm exhausted. My mother's laugh wasn't a sound of amusement. It was sharp and brittle, like ice cracking. I warned you, didn't I, darling? I told you from the start she was too fragile. Too much like her father, all sentiment and no spine. The words were not like blows. They were like poison, seeping into my bloodstream, paralyzing me from the inside out. My legs felt unsteady, rooted to the spot by a weight I couldn't name. Milo looked up at me, his brow furrowed with a child's pure confusion, sensing the gravity of the moment without understanding the words. I brought a trembling finger to my lips, a silent plea for him to stay quiet as the world I had so carefully constructed crumbled into dust around us. The inheritance from her father made it bearable for a while, Julian continued, his tone casual, as if discussing a business transaction. But it's nearly gone. I'm done playing the doting husband to a woman who is fundamentally broken. I had to grab onto the rough bark of the oak to keep my balance. The inheritance. The $250,000 my father had left me, money that was meant to be a safety net, a foundation for Milo's future, a testament to the only unconditional love I had ever known. We had agreed to invest it, to let it grow. Julian had handled it all, of course. He was the practical one. I was too emotional for finances. So, what's your next move? My mother asked. There was an unnerving eagerness in her voice, a predatory gleam I could almost see through the wall. I'm leaving her, he said, the words clean and final. I'll file for divorce after the holidays. I've been documenting her instability. The lawyer says I have a strong case for full custody of Milo. And the assets. Well, she's so trusting. She won't even know what's gone until it's too late. She'll just crumple. That was the moment something inside me didn't die, but was born. The part of me that had spent a lifetime seeking their approval, that had withered under my mother's criticism and bloomed under Julian's rare praise, simply fell away like a dead leaf. In its place, a quiet, cold resolve began to form. It was a clarity so profound it was almost peaceful. I gently tugged Milo's hand, pulling him away from the window, away from the poison. We walked back to the car in a silence broken only by the rustling leaves. My mind, usually a jumble of anxieties and daydreams, was now a quiet, orderly space, already laying the first stones of a new path. They thought I was fragile. They thought I was broken. They were about to learn that the most dangerous thing in the world is a woman who has finally realized she has nothing to lose and everything, including herself, to gain. 3 months earlier, my life had been a series of quiet, predictable rhythms. That morning, a Tuesday in late August, was no different. The sun streamed into our kitchen, illuminating dust motes dancing in the air. Julian was already dressed for work in his Summit Creek construction polo shirt, his presence filling our cozy home with an energy I mistook for strength. He was a respected man in Crestwood, the kind of man who chaired committees and whose opinion was sought at town meetings. I, Clara Monroe, was simply his wife. "Morning, love," he said, brushing a kiss against my temple as I padded into the kitchen. The coffee was already brewed, a small, daily kindness that I held onto like a precious gem. My heart gave its familiar flutter, a conditioned response from a decade of believing I was the luckiest woman in town. "Morning. Is Milo up?" I asked, pouring a mug of the dark roast he favored. "Still dreaming." "I'll wake him in a bit," Julian checked his watch. "Big day today. We're breaking ground on the new community center. It's going to be a long one." I nodded, accustomed to his demanding schedule. His work was his passion, or so he told me. Our time together was limited, making each moment feel all the more valuable. "My mother called yesterday," I said, stirring milk into my coffee. "She wants us to come for Sunday dinner. We haven't been in a few weeks." For a fraction of a second, a shadow crossed Julian's face. A tightening around his eyes, a subtle clench of his jaw. It was gone so quickly I dismissed it as a trick of the light. "Of course, Clara. Whatever you want." Looking back, that flicker was a flare in the darkness, a warning sign I was too willfully blind to see. But I was so pleased that my husband and mother had such a close relationship, a bond I'd always craved with her myself, that I interpreted it as a sign of our perfect family unit. Milo tumbled into the kitchen then, a whirlwind of pajamas and unruly blonde hair. At 9, he was a sketch of the man he would become, all long limbs and thoughtful questions. "Morning, Mom." "Morning, Dad." He grabbed a granola bar, his movements quick and sure. "Easy, champ," Julian said, ruffling Milo's hair with a fond smile. "Listen to your mom. She's the smart one in this family." The warmth of the scene, the casual affection, settled in my chest like a balm. This was my life, my family, my safe harbor. Without them, I was adrift. Or so I believed. Julian left with a perfunctory "love you," and Milo caught the school bus. I began my routine, tidying the house, running a load of laundry, and preparing for my part-time shift at the Gilded Page. The bookstore was my true home. The quiet order of the shelves, the smell of possibility in the air, it was the one place where I felt not like Clara Monroe, Julian's wife, but simply Clara. My boss, Mrs. Gable, a woman in her late 60s with silver hair and eyes that held the wisdom of 1,000 stories, was at the counter when I arrived. "Good morning, Clara. You have a glow about you today," she said. Mrs. Gable was one of the few people who spoke to me as if I were a person of substance. "Thank you, Mrs. Gable. Just a quiet morning." "Those are the best kind," she smiled. "My grandson is visiting this weekend. He's about Milo's age. They should have a play date sometime." A familiar knot of anxiety tightened in my stomach. Socializing meant scrutiny. It meant other parents seeing the cracks in my carefully maintained facade, seeing the fragile woman my mother always said I was. I smiled and nodded noncommittally. The day passed in a pleasant hum of activity. I helped a teenager find a poetry anthology, recommended a historical novel to a regular, and lovingly reshelved books that had been returned. It was simple work, but it gave me a sense of quiet competence. While organizing the biography section, I overheard Mrs. Gable talking to a customer, a well-known town gossip named Brenda. "Saw Julian Monroe having lunch with his mother-in-law at the Willow Cafe yesterday," Brenda said, her voice dripping with insinuation. "They looked awfully chummy. Leaning in close, you know. Very intense." My hands stilled on a biography of Marie Curie. My mother's name was Eleanor. His mother-in-law. They've always been close, haven't they? Mrs. Gable replied, her tone neutral. I suppose, Brenda sniffed. Still, it struck me as odd. You don't often see a man and his mother-in-law looking at each other quite like that. My heart began a frantic, uneven rhythm against my ribs. There had to be an explanation. They were probably planning a surprise for my birthday. Or discussing a health scare of my mother's she didn't want to worry me with. Yes, that had to be it. But a small, cold seed of doubt was planted in the fertile ground of my insecurities. That evening, Julian came home late, smelling of sawdust and exhaustion. Sorry, Clara. The community center project is a beast. He gave me a quick, dry kiss and headed for the shower. How did it go? I asked his retreating back. Good. Productive. We're on schedule. But later, as I was taking out the recycling, I noticed his truck was perfectly clean. No mud on the tires, no dust coating the dashboard. It didn't look like the truck of a man who had just spent 12 hours on a construction site. That night, lying next to his sleeping form, I stared at the ceiling, fighting a tide of unsettling thoughts. Julian loved me. He had chosen me. We had a son, a home, a life. But doubt, once it takes root, is a stubborn weed. The following weeks were a strange, blurry montage. On the surface, our life continued its placid course. But I had started to notice things. The way Julian angled his phone away from me. The new, complex passcode he'd set. The vague answers he gave when I asked about his day. The way he would go out to the garage for long phone calls with suppliers. My mother, too, seemed different. She would ask about Julian's work with a specificity that was unnerving. How is Julian handling the zoning variance for the community center? She asked once. I had never mentioned a zoning variance. You know, Crestwood, Julian had shrugged when I asked him about it. News travels fast. It was true. Crestwood was a town woven together by gossip and shared histories. Still, it felt wrong. Then came that Thursday in November. Milo had a half day at school, and I'd taken the afternoon off. As we shared a grilled cheese sandwich, he looked up at me with wide, innocent eyes. Can we go see Grandma Eleanor? I miss her. My mother had always insisted on being called by her full name, claiming Grandma sounded old. I always thought it sounded distant. I don't know, sweetie. I should call first. I tried her landline, then her mobile. Both went straight to voicemail. Maybe she's just home and not answering, Milo suggested with a child's simple logic. We could just drive by. Her house was a 20-minute drive away, a neat brick colonial on a street lined with mature maples. The drive was beautiful, the world painted in fiery strokes of crimson and gold. But as we turned onto her street, a shard of ice pierced my heart. Julian's clean, gleaming truck was parked in her driveway. I pulled the car over to the curb a few houses down, my hands trembling on the steering wheel. Hey, that's Dad's truck, Milo said, peering out the window. Why is he here? I don't know, honey, I managed. My mind spun, desperately searching for a plausible explanation. A leaky faucet. A broken shutter. A surprise they were planning. Should we go in? Milo asked, already unbuckling his seatbelt. Wait, I said, a primal instinct flaring up inside me. A deep, gut-level certainty that walking up to that front door would be a mistake. Let's just see if we can see them in the back garden. Maybe they're outside. We slipped out of the car and walked quietly along the sidewalk, then cut across the neighbor's lawn to the back of my mother's property. The large kitchen window, the same window I used to peer out of as a child, waiting for my father to come home, faced the backyard. And that's when I heard it. The sound of my world ending. Not with a bang, but with the quiet, cruel words of the two people I had built my life around. After the litany of complaints, the financial revelations, the dismissal of my worth, my mother asked the question that sealed their fate. When are you going to do it? Soon, Julian said. After the holidays. I don't want to ruin Christmas for Milo. He doesn't deserve to be caught in the middle of this. A flicker of something, was it relief? That he still cared about our son was quickly extinguished by my mother's derisive snort. You're too sentimental, Julian. Like his grandfather. At least he had the decency to die and leave Clara some money for a man like you to find her. That was it. The final, clarifying blow. My father, a kind, gentle man who had taught me to see the beauty in small things, reduced to a financial windfall. My entire marriage, a transaction. My love, a liability. The rage that rose in me was unlike anything I had ever felt. It wasn't hot and messy. It was cold, clean, and utterly silent. It was the quiet click of a lock falling into place. I steered Milo back toward the car, my movements steady and deliberate. "Mom, are you okay?" "You're really pale," he said, his small face a portrait of concern. "I'm fine, sweetie," I said, my voice even, almost serene. "Change of plans. We're going to go home and have some ice cream." "But what about Dad and Grandma?" "They're busy," I said, starting the car. "We'll see them later." As I drove away from the house where I grew up, from the life I thought was mine, my mind was no longer a jumble of anxieties. It was a blueprint. They thought I was a porcelain doll. They were about to discover I was made of steel. That night, after Julian was asleep, I slipped out of bed and went to the small home office where we kept our financial records. For years, I had avoided this room. Julian handled everything, telling me not to worry my pretty little head about it. The condescension I had once interpreted as affection now tasted like ash in my mouth. I pulled out the file labeled Monroe Inheritance. The truth was far worse than I had overheard. Of the $250,000, only a fraction remained in the investment account we had opened together. Large sums had been systematically transferred out. $80,000 to an account I didn't recognize. $50,000 in cash withdrawals over the past year. Tens of thousands spent on business expenses for Summit Creek Construction, a company I now suspected was floundering. I sat there until the first pale light of dawn crept through the window, surrounded by a paper trail of betrayal. I saw it all. Julian's premeditated theft, my mother's complicity, their shared contempt for me. The phone records showed near-daily calls between them, long conversations at times he claimed to be on a job site. They hadn't just underestimated me. They had erased me. And I was about to write myself back into existence. The next morning, I called Mrs. Gable and told her I was feeling unwell and wouldn't be in. It was the first lie in a new life of strategic truths. After Julian left for his work and Milo was on the school bus, I drove to the bank. "Good morning, Mrs. Monroe," the teller greeted me warmly. "I need to speak with your fraud department," I said, my voice calm and clear. The meeting with a kind, professional woman named Sarah confirmed my worst fears. The account with $80,000 of my money was a joint account in the names of Julian Monroe and Eleanor Croft, my mother. Opened 6 months ago. Sarah showed me the transfer authorization forms. My signature was on every one. A perfect, fluid forgery. "This is your signature, Mrs. Monroe," Sarah said gently. "If you're saying you didn't sign these." "I'm saying I need copies of every single one," I said, cutting her off. I wasn't ready to make a formal accusation. Not yet. My next stop was not the Gilded Page, but the public library in the next county over, a place where no one knew me. I spent hours on a public computer, diving into the arcane world of divorce law, asset seizure, forensic accounting, and criminal fraud. I learned that what Julian had done wasn't just immoral, it was illegal. Forgery, embezzlement, conspiracy. These were not just hurtful words. They were crimes. By the time I picked Milo up from school, a plan was solidifying in my mind. It was not a plan for revenge. It was a plan for justice. "How was school?" I asked, my voice lighter than it had been in months. "It was good. We learned about camouflage in science class," he said. "How animals protect themselves by blending in, so their enemies don't even see them until it's too late." I smiled. "That's a very smart strategy, Milo." That night, I played the part of the perfect wife. I made Julian's favorite meal, beef bourguignon. I listened attentively as he spun another tale about the challenges at the community center. "You seem in a good mood tonight," he commented, reaching for my hand across the table. "I am," I said, and for the first time in a long time, it felt true. I had a purpose. "I was thinking," I added, my tone casual, "we should have my mother over for dinner this weekend. It feels like it's been ages." The flicker was back in his eyes, but this time it was accompanied by a flash of something else. Greed? Triumph? That's a wonderful idea, Clara. I'm sure Eleanor would love that. Eleanor. Not your mom. The subtle shift in language was as loud as a gunshot in the quiet of my new awareness. That night, as he slept, I didn't stare at the ceiling. I planned. Phase 1, discovery, was complete. Phase 2, documentation, was underway. Phase 3, execution, would be the final chapter. And I would be the one to write it. In the days that followed, I became a master of camouflage. On the surface, I was the same Clara, quiet, accommodating, a little fragile. But beneath the surface, a different woman was at work. I bought a small, high-quality digital recorder and a tiny, discreet security camera, the kind marketed as a nanny cam. The Saturday dinner was a masterclass in psychological warfare, though only one of us knew a war was being waged. The camera was nestled among the books on the living room mantelpiece. The recorder was in the pocket of my apron. My mother arrived, radiating a smug sympathy that set my teeth on edge. "Clara, darling, you look worn out. Is Julian working you too hard?" she asked, a jab disguised as concern. "I'm just a little tired, Mom," I replied, my voice perfectly pitched with practiced weariness. Dinner was an exercise in careful observation. The shared glances between Julian and Eleanor. The inside jokes that excluded me. The easy intimacy of their conversation. "Oh, Julian," my mother said, dabbing her lips with a napkin. "Did you ever manage to sort out that issue with the lumber supplier?" It was a topic I'd never heard of, but Julian answered smoothly. "All handled, Eleanor. Thanks for asking." Later, when I was in the kitchen, I heard their hushed, urgent whispers. I couldn't make out the words, but the tone was unmistakable. They were co-conspirators. My performance was flawless. When Julian came home late on a Wednesday, claiming another grueling day at the non-existent community center project, I didn't question him. Instead, I waited until he was asleep, then slipped out of the house. I drove past my mother's. His truck was in the driveway. This time, I was prepared. I parked down the street, my digital recorder in hand, and crept through the shadows to the familiar spot beneath the kitchen window. "When are we going to tell her about us?" My mother's voice was sharp, impatient. "Patience, Eleanor. We have to get the rest of the money first. The house is next. I've got the refinancing papers ready. Her signature is easy enough to fake. Once the equity is in our account, I'll file. And Milo, I'll get full custody." Julian's voice was cold. Who would give a child to a woman with a documented history of anxiety and depression? "She's emotionally unstable." The pieces clicked into place. His suggestions that I see a therapist. His careful documentation of every time I cried or expressed frustration. He wasn't trying to help me. He was building a case against me. I recorded every damning word, then slipped away into the night, my heart a cold, hard stone in my chest. The next morning, I made 3 calls. The first was to Victoria Kent, the sharpest divorce attorney in the next county. The second was to Mr. Harris, a discreet private investigator she recommended. The third was back to Sarah at the bank's fraud department. "I'm ready to make a formal report," I told her. By the end of the week, my arsenal was complete. I had bank records proving the theft. I had recordings proving their conspiracy. And after Mr. Harris spent one evening parked across from a seedy motel on the edge of town, I had crystal-clear photographs of my husband and my mother, kissing in the parking lot before disappearing into room 112. Now, all I needed was the final, devastating blow. I needed to let their greed lead them into the final, inescapable trap. That Friday, I set the bait. I dressed up, did my makeup, and greeted Julian at the door with a radiant smile. "Wow," he said, taken aback. "What's the occasion?" "I just felt like celebrating," I said. Over a dinner of roasted chicken, I dropped the bomb. "I had the most interesting call today," I said, sipping my wine. "From my father's insurance company. It turns out there was a clause in his policy about long-term investment growth. There's a final payout. A significant one." Julian's fork clattered against his plate. "Significant? How significant?" I shrugged, feigning nonchalance. "They said it could be another 100,000. Maybe more. It'll take a few weeks to process. The storm of emotions that crossed his face was a thing to behold. Shock, naked greed, and then a dawning, panicked calculation. He would have to wait. He couldn't leave me now, not with that much money on the table. That's incredible, Clara, he stammered. Later that night, I heard him on the phone in the kitchen, whispering frantically. Eleanor, we have to wait. There's more money. A lot more. I smiled in the darkness. The trap was set. The next 2 weeks were a strange purgatory. I existed in a state of suspended animation, playing the part of the fragile, hopeful wife while my team prepared for the endgame. Victoria filed the divorce papers, the motion to freeze all our assets, and the petition for an emergency custody order, all to be executed on a specific date. Mr. Harris compiled his evidence into a damning report. The district attorney's office, alerted by the bank, began building their criminal case. The day arrived with a cold, clear sky. D-Day. I took Milo to school, hugging him a little tighter than usual. I love you more than all the books in the world, I whispered. Then I drove to a small cafe, ordered a tea I couldn't drink, and waited. At 10:15 a.m., my phone rang. It was Victoria. The server just left his office. And the accounts are frozen. He's been served. The second call came 10 minutes later from a blocked number. It was Julian, his voice a raw, snarling mess of rage and disbelief. What have you done, you stupid, crazy bitch? You've ruined everything. No, Julian, I said, my voice as calm as a frozen lake. You did. I hung up before he could respond. The third call was from a Crestwood police officer. Julian was at the station, making wild accusations about my mental state. I calmly agreed to come in and give my statement. I walked into the police station, not as the fragile Clara Monroe they all thought they knew, but as the architect of my own liberation. I laid out the files on the detective's desk, the bank statements, the audio transcripts, the glossy 8x10 photos from the motel. The detective, a man who had known me my whole life, stared at the evidence, then at me, with a newfound respect. My God, Clara, he said softly. You've been through a war. Yes, I said. And I won. Julian and my mother were arrested that afternoon. The charges were extensive: fraud, embezzlement, conspiracy. The scandal rocked Crestwood to its core. The legal proceedings were swift. Faced with the mountain of irrefutable evidence, they both accepted plea bargains. Julian was sentenced to 3 years in a state prison. My mother, for her role as a co-conspirator, received 18 months. I was granted a full, uncontested divorce. The house, the remaining inheritance, and every asset Julian had tried to steal were returned to me. I was granted sole custody of Milo. A few months after the sentencing, a letter arrived, postmarked from a women's correctional facility. It was from my mother. It was not an apology full of excuses, but a stark, raw admission of her jealousy, her bitterness, and her profound regret. You were never weak, Clara, she wrote. I just needed you to be, because your strength reminded me of everything I wasn't. I folded the letter and placed it in a box. It wasn't a pardon, but it was a period at the end of a very long, painful sentence. Today, 5 years later, the woman who stood behind that oak tree is a distant memory. I sold the house on Willow Creek Lane and bought a small cottage on the other side of town, one with a garden where Milo and I grow tomatoes and basil. I am now the owner of the Gilded Page, after Mrs. Gable retired and sold it to me, her most worthy successor. I have raised a son who is kind and empathetic, who knows that true strength lies not in dominance, but in integrity. He's 14 now, and he still loves stories, but he also understands that he is the author of his own. Sometimes, new people in town will hear whispers of the scandal and look at me with pity. They don't understand. That day was not the end of my life, it was the beginning. It was the moment I stopped being a footnote and started writing my own story. They thought they were taking everything from me, but in the end, the only thing they managed to take was my fear. They set me free, and for that, in the strangest of ways, I will be forever grateful.